And I wonder if anyone would please text us in the chat so that we know that you're connected, because I can tell Carolyn and I are now connected.
This is the funniest thing.
Let's see.
Welcome to 2022. We'll get this down. Might take us another couple years. I think people can see us, so I guess that you could just continue with the sex hormone binding globulin because it's fascinating.
Definitely will. And I am hoping that people are seeing us and someone would say so in the chat.
I'm not sure if they can find us.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
continue with sex hormone binding globulin. So these steroid hormones, these fat-soluble hormones, are excreted by the ovary into the bloodstream, and they're immediately bound up by these serum proteins. Thank you, Facebook user.
So thank you so much, you guys.
Yeah. And they're and sex hormone binding globulin is one of these serum proteins that binds up all these different steroid hormones and carries it around to every cell, tissue, and organ in the body and drops them off where they need to be when they need to do their thing, like in the uterus in a young woman. It drops them off at the uterus, and the estrogen helps form an endometrial lining. And you probably have to mute, Carolyn, so we're getting that other goodie that we got, that crackle. And drops them off at the breast, and estrogen stimulates breast glandular tissue in preparation for possible implantation, fertilization, and breastfeeding every single cycle. They go do their thing. Estrogen goes, protects the arteries, protects the brain, the bones. Progesterone helps the bones, the mood, the brain, and on and on and on. Testosterone protects the muscles, gives you muscle strength, gives you drive, component of your mood. And they're all dropped off at various parts of the body from being carried to the various parts of the body by sex hormone binding globulin. And there's normal ranges for that, and it's wonderful. And then you take a young woman who's taking the birth control pills, and she's at the maximum output of her ovary, of her hormones, and she's given extra estradiol, extra estrogen, as part of the birth control pill. And her body goes, wow, we're now dealing with an excessive amount of estrogen. We don't need this much estrogen. Well, is there any safety measure we could use to protect us from this extra estrogen? We like normal levels of estrogen. We don't like excessive levels of estrogen. Well, what the body can do is it can increase the production of sex hormone binding globulin for the purpose of mopping up or binding up any excessive levels of estrogen and testosterone that are floating around.
So can I ask you quickly? It's like a protective
Yes,
device.
precisely. The body's got thousands and thousands of these protective to what? Keep anything that matters that's floating around in the body in optimal ranges, not too much and not too little. There's many, many other systems that operate in this way. And an interesting thing, when the young woman takes the birth control pill, that sex hormone binding globulin can easily go up. And what it does when it goes up is it's going to bind up some of the estrogen, which is excessive, but it's also going to bind up the testosterone. And a lot of women who are on the birth control pill get diminished libido because that elevated sex hormone binding globulin has also bound up some of their precious, wonderful testosterone. Now, theory would have it that when a woman stops taking the birth control pill, there will be no more need for additional sex hormone binding globulin. So the sex hormone binding globulin amount, as measured in the bloodstream on a blood test, would revert to normal ranges. And it does a lot of the time. And it doesn't revert to normal ranges some of the time. And there's many women who've entered menopause And we take a very, very careful and thorough history, and we do that sex hormone binding globulin. And by God, they entered menopause with a partially elevated sex hormone binding globulin. And we do the history, and we can only see one reason for it. They were on the birth control pill. And you'd think they'd have to be on the birth control pill for years. No, not necessarily so. We've had women, since I've been specializing in this for 25 years, we've had women who took the birth control pill for 3 months, didn't really like it, stopped it, and they still have an elevated sex hormone binding globulin 20, 30 years later. Now, this is not a disease. It's not an illness, as you started to point out, Carolyn. It's part of the body's natural protective mechanism. You get too much hormones, you raise the sex hormone binding globulin, you mop up or bind up what extra that you don't need. Not
I
an
think,
illness.
I'm sorry, I think that women feel that it's dangerous, like a high sex hormone binding globulin is dangerous. I think there's a big fear there.
Thank you. And so I want to address that directly. Don't be afraid. It's not an illness. It's part of the body's natural response, and there's nothing to be afraid of. Zero. The sex hormone binding globulin goes way up. There's nothing to be afraid of. When I see an elevated sex hormone binding globulin, when we've tested a woman, when we first start consulting with her, I don't say to her, "Oh my God, we have to stop. You're in trouble here." No, I don't even mention it, because I know a slightly elevated or even a moderately elevated sex hormone globulin may not cause any problems. And it's not an illness. So I make very light of it because I don't want to plant a seed in a woman's mind that she's going to have trouble from an elevated sex hormone binding globulin. No way. So I say, oh, you got a little bit of elevation of sex hormone binding globulin. We're going to see how this play out. It may not affect you at all. I wouldn't say that about an elevated fasting blood glucose. I'd say, oh, we got to link you up with your primary care physician, because this is something we really want to inspect. You've got an elevated hemoglobin A1C, you've got an elevated fasting blood glucose. We just don't want to pretend that this is a zero. It's not going to affect you. We don't do that with other elevations. When we see elevated liver enzymes, we don't go, oh, it's fine, we're just going to let them be elevated. No, we want to find out what's really going on. But that's not true about a sex hormone binding globulin. I make very light of it, because I know that in many women, it's not going to interfere at all with the hormone program. And they'll live their whole life with a slightly elevated sex hormone binding globulin and will still be able to achieve the wonderful kind of balance and levels that we want of the hormones, no problem. That's why I don't say boo about it, other than if a woman asks me, she said, well, look at that, I've got an elevated sex hormone binding globulin. I say, well, yeah, but let's not think about it, because it's liable to not make a difference at all, and it's not an illness. It's not a disease. It's part of the body's natural protective mechanism. It's probably elevated because you took the birth control pill. So, no, don't sweat it. If we have to deal with it, we will. Now, there are a small number of women where the sex hormone binding globulin is a problem. It's not an illness, it's not a disease, it's nothing to be afraid of, but it binds up too much of the hormones. The sex hormone binding globulin is a little too high. And so if the sex hormone binding globulin is a little high, we could say, well, these are the hormones we're treating with. Well, we'll just raise the level of hormones we're treating with. We'll just give her additional hormones. In some women, that'll totally solve it. We give them a little higher levels. The sex hormone binding globulin is high, but it stays stable. That's why I don't make any kind of deal with it whatsoever. But there's some women, if we raise that actual estrogen level, for example, or testosterone level, the sex hormone binding globulin is liable to elevate. And you get in this staircase climbing ladder thing where the more hormones you give, the more the sex hormone binding globulin raises. This is not an illness. It's just a management challenge. It's not an illness. There's nothing to be afraid of. It's just a management challenge.
I
So
love
there's,
that you say management challenge, because that's where the specialty comes in and the puzzle piecing and the, I mean, that's a great way to put it.
Right on, Carolyn. It's just one more of, you know, go try and treat men in andropause. And does it go smoothly and perfectly and exactly and one dose fits all? And here, take two and call me next year? No way. Anyone who's doing a good job with men is measuring a lot of different things and have got a lot of different elements to their program. This is not something that's unique to women because the original design is so intricate and beautiful and balanced. No problem for someone who knows what they're doing. We just keep working the program until the woman is intricate, beautiful, and balanced, right? And sex hormone binding globulin is only one of a multitude of challenges that can arise, but all they are is challenges. All you have to do is figure it out. It's like anything else.
So in this with this questioner, when she's talking about her estradiol being high, but she's not anyway, it all kind of is part and parcel to everything that you're saying because they're all kind of interconnected, right?
Well, in trying to interpret her specific program, I'm going to ask you, not right now, but I'm going to ask you to reread it, but there wasn't enough information, and that's typical. But I want to make a few more general comments about sex hormone binding globulin. There is a pharmaceutical medication that will lower sex hormone binding globulin, and in men who have elevated sex hormone binding globulin, ta-da, me, and in women who have elevated sex hormone binding globulin, you, oh, look at that. We got two people who got sex hormone binding globulin issues on this very call. We take a pharmaceutical medication called danazol because it's the only thing I found thus far that'll actually lower the sex hormone binding globulin. And we go for the smallest amount. The amount of danazol we take is nothing compared to what's given to a woman with endometriosis, for example, in which danazol is used. What is it? 10 to 30 times higher dosages when you've got endometriosis, something like that. So there is something we can do about an elevated sex hormone binding globulin, but I never start out a woman who's got an elevated sex hormone binding globulin by saying to her, oh, we're going to treat you with danazol. No, because sometimes even though she's got an elevated sex hormone binding globulin, we start giving her the hormones and the sex hormone binding globulin does not go higher. So we don't have to be concerned about it at all because it's not an illness. It's just a compensatory mechanism. And all it can do is present a challenge that we can rise to the occasion and do it. I'm not going to ask you to repeat the questioner's question because there was too much of a jumble in there. I needed numbers. I needed testosterone numbers. I needed sex hormone binding globulin numbers. So it would be a mistake to try and answer that question right now. If the woman would like to submit her numbers on a different day, well, we could respond to that. But
One and think, whoa, that's a question right there, and I will get to that when I can read it.
I saw it. I saw that. I saw why you went woo there.
Yeah, but I definitely I want and hi there from the UK. I think I know exactly who you are. And I will get to that question. But I wanted to ask Dr. Rosensweet, because the question does come in, and I get this a lot. What is the optimal number for sex hormone binding globulin? There isn't one, right?
That's
Or is
right.
there?
Well, it depends on the lab, and I opened up answering this question by saying this. The laboratories differ in the reference range they use for sex hormone binding globulin. That's not true for many, many other serum analytes, but it happens to be the two major laboratories have two different reference ranges. And so never mind the specific number, take a look next to your report, next to the number reported for sex hormone binding globulin, there's going to be a reference range. So you'll see something like 78, and then you'll see to the right of it, you'll see in parentheses reference range 60 or 50, I forgot what the low number is because I don't pay much attention to the low number, to 125 or 129. So let's just say 60 to 129. Where you should be, if that's the reference range, is somewhere in the middle or at the upper end, or even the lower end, but you should be within that reference range, whatever the laboratory is that you're using. Now, if you're above the upper number, like with the LabCorp example that I gave you, because I think the upper number is 129. If you're above 129, let's say you're 140, you have an elevated sex hormone binding globulin. But here's what I wanted to emphasize to you. I'm not going to say to my patient where I see that result of 140, I'm not going to say to her, oh, we've got a problem here, because I know that it may not factor in as being an issue in the dose discovery of the various ovarian hormones, and in their administration may not be a problem at all. So I make real light of it, and I probably don't even comment on it unless the woman says, but doctor, I just showed you my blood tests, and I've got this elevated sex hormone binding globulin. Here's what I say. Yes, I see it, but it's just part of it. It's not an illness. It's just part of the body's natural regulatory system. There's reasons why it's elevated, but we're not going to deal with those reasons right now because it may not make a jot of a difference in the program we're going to develop with you. So you can forget about it. And we'll find out if it's going to make a difference. If it is, we'll find out in the process, and then there's things we can do about it. But the question was, what's the number? I can't give you a number. There's a reference range.
Right. And women are, and I am very guilty of this myself for sure, wanting numbers, optimal ranges, numbers of
Well,
this.
the labs give something called a reference range. And how do they determine those? They do testing on the last 1,000 women that showed up, and they do a bell-shaped curve, which is a statistical analysis of the numbers they actually got. And this is very reliable in ways, they know that 90% of the women who report the number are going to be in a certain range right there in the middle or slightly off the middle, 1 or 2 standard deviations beyond the middle or the median. And then there's going to be the outliers. There's going to be the ones that are larger than that or smaller than those 2 standard deviations, and they're going to name those people as abnormal numbers. So all you need to do is be within 1 or 2 standard deviations of the mean or the median, and you're going to be fine, especially with sex hormone binding globulin. Now, I don't necessarily feel that way about fasting blood glucose. For example, a fasting blood glucose, the range from a lot of laboratories, there's a pretty much uniformity here, is 65 to 99. But I know something. If someone comes in with a 99, I'm not going to say, oh, you're fine. You're within the reference range. No. Young people, for example, people in their 20s and 30s, most of them are going to come in the high 60s or the low 70s because they've got good control over that fasting glucose. But when I start seeing adult numbers, like people in their 40s or 50s, they're creeping up. They're getting above 80. They're getting above 85. I know what's happening. They're developing insulin resistance, and they're no longer able to control their fasting blood glucose. So when I see a fasting blood glucose of 90 or 95, I don't say to the person, you're perfectly fine, you're within the reference range. I say, let's go contact your family doc or your internist because it's time to make some dietary changes and acquire some stress tools because you're fine now, but this is rising, and we don't want to. We want to know what it's going to be in 10 years from now, and you got to change some habits there, or it's not going to be okay in 10 years. You're going to get diabetes somewhere in there. So I'm just giving you an example that there's sometimes I do say something sitting high in the reference range. That is a problem. And if it's not a problem now, it's going to be in 5 or 10 years. But I'm not saying that about the sex hormone binding globulin. A lot of the elevations that are occurring in women who are brand new to menopause and have not been treated with hormones since they took the birth control pill when they were younger they can have an elevated sex hormone binding globulin. And like I've been saying several times here, I'm not going to call that out as a problem. We know that sometimes when that sex hormone binding globulin was caused to raise by a natural process by a young woman who was producing maximum amount of estrogen and testosterone out of her ovaries when she was young, and then she's given extra estrogen that's in the birth control pill, her body raised the sex hormone binding globulin to protect her from excessive levels of estrogen. That's all it did. And most of the time, that when she stops the birth control pill, that goes back into normal. But not all the time. So some women enter menopause and they've got an elevated sex hormone binding globulin. I know I'm repeating myself. And how did they get that? I look into her medical history, which we take a very, 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 did I say very? Very, very thorough medical history. And one of the questions is, were you ever on the birth control pill? And she says, yes, but I was only on it for 3 months when I was 22. Oh, that's enough. That's enough to elevate it. Or I was on it for 20 years. Oh, that's enough to elevate it. And it didn't return to normal. But again, I want to emphasize that doesn't mean we're going to have a problem with this or a challenge with this. And if we do, there's something we can do about it. So
Well,
that's
right
pretty.
there is the really good news. And I see that we have, what, 7 minutes left. And I'm wondering, my mind is wondering, because this has just been brought up. I have other questions here that I'm more than happy to present on Thursday and put them all together as I do. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, is coming up a lot. And I wanted to present this question because FSH is coming up a lot. So the question is, if we're well into menopause, is FSH level important to be aware of if we are well into menopause?
Well, in yes and no. Let me tell you what FSH is. Follicle stimulating hormone. And it's a hormone produced in the pituitary gland at the base of your brain. And it's produced and it's monitored by something that's taking place within your brain, the hypothalamus. But I don't want to get that complex. In a young woman, if you look at a menstrual cycle, there's times when the follicle stimulating hormone is elevated during the cycle because it's trying to get the ovarian follicle to mature. So it depends what in a young woman, when you test her where she is in her cycle, what that FSH is going to be. But it's going to be relatively low number, and it's going to vary throughout the menstrual cycle. And then there comes the time when the ovary is no longer doing it. The ovarian follicles are no longer putting out the hormones that a woman's body is used to. And the pituitary gland via the brain and the hypothalamus goes, uh-oh, this looks like fertility is changing. The ovary is not putting out its robust levels of wonderful hormones it used to. What can we do? Let's raise the FSH. Let's give it up. Let's stimulate that ovary stronger. And it does. And in the perimenopause, you start getting higher levels of follicle stimulating hormone. This is not an illness. This is not a problem. It's how the brain and the pituitary tries to keep a woman fertile, tries to really drive those ovaries into, let's keep going here now. The whole human race, we don't want to lose, we've got to keep producing babies. I think there was a time in our history that was important. I think that time is long over. But at any rate, I won't go into the politics of this here. So women in the perimenopause get an elevation of their FSH, and the same thing happens with another pituitary hormone that relates to the ovary called LH, or luteinizing hormone. These two hormones start to elevate, and the intention is the same. The pituitary is trying to keep that ovary alive, and it doesn't do it. It can get the ovary to put out some bursts, so the perimenopause is loaded with these bursts as the brain, the pituitary goes, uh-oh, the estrogen's low. Let's give a burst of FSH to see if we can stimulate that ovary. And lo and behold, the ovary puts out some extra estrogen. But it can't keep it up because the ovary is going through what's known as the change of life. And the change we're talking about is the ovaries cease to keep a woman fertile. They cease doing it. It turns out that because of this back and forth with this elevated FSH push, that we start getting, instead of these smooth levels of estrogen output during a month, we start getting these erratic levels because you get a drop, a push from the FSH, an elevated FSH, a peak, a drop, and you get these erratic levels in the perimenopause. This is not a problem. All you have to do is go to someone who knows what they're doing, and they know what this is about, and they know how to manage it, and it's not a big deal. Now, once an FSH goes up in a woman, it never goes down. And you've got women in their 80s and 90s that they've never been treated with hormones, and you measure an FSH, and that thing is sky high. In other words, the brain and the pituitary gland never give up on the possibility of reviving those ovaries. Staggering. But I thought, yeah, and how healthy is that for a woman to be putting out high FSH levels when she's 90? I don't think it is that healthy. It feels like there's a strain on the pituitary, but I don't see any immediate adverse consequences, and I don't see any illnesses develop from it. But it's always felt a little funny to me that the brain and the pituitary will never give up to try and keep a woman fertile. Even when she's in her 80s and 90s, she hasn't seen a period for 30 years. Now, there is a way to lower the FSH. It's to give a woman estrogen. So a woman who goes on hormone replenishment treatment, her FSH that was once high is now going to start to lower because her brain and pituitary is going to go, thank goodness we're getting some estrogen. This really matters. We don't have to crank out that FSH. We're getting estrogen. How reliable is that to assess whether a woman has the right amount of estrogen? I call it not sufficiently reliable. Not exact enough. There is a corollary in the world of thyroid. There's a thyroid stimulating hormone that's coming out of the pituitary gland. And when thyroid glandular production of thyroid hormone diminishes and you're not getting enough, that TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, is going to increase to try and stimulate the thyroid to punch out some more thyroid hormone because it's a critical, powerful biochemical as well. Uh-oh. These are similar things, but they're not illnesses. They're not diseases. They're part of a natural response. So we treat women with thyroid hormone, and we'll watch that TSH go down. And we'll treat women with ovarian hormones, and we'll watch that FSH go down. If it was the only tool I had to biochemically assess whether a woman was on the right amount of estrogen, I would probably turn to it. But just like TSH, in order to really accurately assess the thyroid, there's at least 4 thyroid blood test analytes that we need. So I don't rely on the FSH at all. I rely on something that's fabulous, excellent, scientific, fantastic, has been used from the late 60s as the gold standard. I rely on the 24-hour urine hormone test to assess whether estrogen levels and testosterone levels, progesterone levels, and DHEA levels are at an optimal zone for a menopausal woman. There are people who are correlating recently whether FSH is related directly to weight gain. Woohoo! And there's pharmaceutical manufacturers who've developed an FSH lowering drug to get the FSH lower as if that's going to affect the weight gain. And as one of my beloved colleagues who's a living expert in hormones, he's the one who brought bioidentical hormones to the planet Earth, Dr. Jonathan Wright. Shout out to Jonathan Wright, Jonathan. Be surprised in your busy day if you're tuning into our Facebook Live. And when we first heard about this particular drug that was developed to lower the FSH, Jonathan just shook his head and said they just can't get over it. Why don't they use nature's FSH lowering called estrogens? Yeah, because we see the FSH lower all the time. Goes real high, a woman's got no ovarian hormones left, we give her estrogens, her FSH comes down. So it gets pretty wild out there.
It's like the wild, wild west.
Yeah, but at any rate, FSH, I don't find it useful because all I have to do is listen to a woman in midlife, and I'm going to tell you what her FSH is. If she's got hot flashes, for example, her FSH is high. It ain't what it was when she was young. Getting hot flashes from estrogen deficiency, and that pituitary gland is going to squirt out some more FSH to try and get that ovary to get that estradiol and estriol and estrone back into reasonable ranges. So I don't find that technically accurate enough to be how I measure hormone levels. But I do find the 24-hour urine hormone level testing to just be wonderfully accurate and precise. So that's what
Yeah,
we. Now, if the only tool I had was trying to measure the FSH, well, I would do it, but it's too crude. It's just like TSH for the thyroid. It ain't enough information. So that's FSH. And why I think people raise it as a possibility is it's been known about and tested for decades and decades and decades. It was known that FSH raises in menopause. It's going to lower if you're going to treat a woman with hormones. So it's an old standby. In fact, gynecologists often use FSH elevation as the marker of menopause. Oh, you're in menopause, your FSH is so high. But they use something far more practical. They say, yeah, you haven't had a period for a year. Now you're in menopause. And now I can tell you this, you're not going to get pregnant because you haven't had a period for a year. And they're not going to use the FSH to determine that. They're going to use this historical fact called you haven't had a period for a year. So there's some information about follicle stimulating hormone.
thank you. It's not really something we really have visited too much, and that's why I wanted to bring it up.
Right.
Yeah,
And you know what, my dear?
I know. Don't say
Okay.
it. We gotta go. Thank you, Dr. Rosensweet. Thank you, ladies, so much. I've got my work cut out for me, that is for sure. And I will get to all of that. Appreciate you, sir, always. Appreciate you, ladies, always. Have a fabulous day today. Laugh a lot.
The final technical thing I'd like to say is that we see your questions come up in the chat, but Carolyn does such a diligent effort towards
Mm.
organizing these questions and presenting the ones that have been previously asked. Occasionally we'll turn to the chat and answer it right away, but it's not like we forget about you and that chat isn't meaningful. Right after Carolyn and I hang up, I've taken screenshots of everything in the chat, and Carolyn will diligently, and thank you so much, Carolyn, you're so organized, it's wonderful. You organize and set up these questions for the following Facebook Live or a couple down the line because we accumulate quite a lot of questions. So thank you for that, Carolyn.
Well, and thank you for thanking me. I appreciate it. It's a lot of work, but it's so rewarding to me. It's what I love. So I have no problem with it. And I'm really lucky to have you. We all are, and we all know it. So, again, thank you for the shout out to me. Thank you, ladies, for being here. Always, Dr. Rosensweet, such a pleasure to see you. And I guess that we will all be talking to you on Thursday.
Yes, yes,
We're
yes.
going to make it work one way or another. We will reappear.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks, everybody.
See you, everybody. Bye.